Hay una pregunta que los ateos lanzan en debate sobre la resurrección, y que la mayoría de cristianos no saben responder sin apelar a la Biblia. La pregunta es simple. ¿Tienes alguna evidencia que no provenga de un libro que ya crees que es verdad? Y ahí es donde la mayoría se detiene. Porque si la única respuesta que tienes es lo dice la Escritura, entonces el ateo tiene razón en no encontrar eso convincente. No porque la Biblia sea falsa, sino porque estás razonando en círculo, usas el texto para probar el texto. Hoy eso cambia. Hay un caso para la resurrección de Jesús construido sobre hechos que incluso los historiadores más críticos, incluyendo agnósticos y ateos especialistas en el Jesús histórico, reconocen como históricamente fundamentados. No tienes que asumir que la Biblia es la palabra de Dios para que este argumento funcione. Tienes que estar dispuesto a seguir la evidencia. Y hay algo más. El testigo más inesperado de todos para la resurrección no es un teólogo ni un predicador. Es el mayor experto en mitología de Oxford en el siglo XX, un hombre que pasó su vida leyendo mitos de todas las culturas del mundo, que llegó a los evangelios buscando otro mito, y que encontró algo que lo sorprendió contra su propia voluntad intelectual. Ese hombre es C.S. Lewis. Vamos a construir este argumento desde los cimientos. Primero las reglas del juego, qué cuenta como evidencia histórica y qué no. Luego los hechos que nadie puede ignorar. Luego el problema que ninguna alternativa logra resolver del todo. Y finalmente el argumento que Lewis aportó desde un lugar que ningún teólogo hubiera pensado, la crítica literaria. Al final de este video tendrás 3 o 4 argumentos concretos que no dependen de presupuestos religiosos. Argumentos que puedes usar en conversación con un escéptico. O con tus propias dudas que a veces son el interlocutor más exigente. Antes de hablar de evidencia, hay que establecer qué estamos haciendo exactamente. No estamos tratando de probar la resurrección con la certeza matemática de un teorema. Eso nadie puede hacerlo con ningún evento histórico, ni con la caída del Imperio Romano ni con el cruce del Rubicón. La historia no funciona así. Lo que hace un historiador serio es recolectar los hechos disponibles y preguntarse, ¿qué hipótesis los explica mejor? Esa distinción importa más de lo que parece. Porque la pregunta correcta no es, ¿puedes probar que Jesús resucitó? La pregunta correcta es, ¿cuál es la mejor explicación para los hechos que tenemos? Y si la respuesta a esa segunda pregunta resulta ser la resurrección, entonces el creyente no está haciendo un salto ciego al vacío. Está siguiendo el mismo método que usamos para reconstruir cualquier evento del pasado. Ahora bien, el segundo punto sobre las reglas del juego. El argumento que vamos a construir tiene una restricción deliberada. Solo usaremos hechos que los propios historiadores críticos reconocen, no como acto de fe, sino como conclusión de su trabajo académico. Historiadores escépticos. Agnósticos. Algunos abiertamente ateos. Lo que los une no es la fe cristiana, sino el rigor metodológico. ¿Por qué importa eso? Porque elimina de raíz la objeción de circularidad. Si el argumento descansa sobre hechos que incluso los críticos de la resurrección tienen que aceptar, entonces el punto de partida es terreno compartido. No estás predicando a un coro, estás debatiendo con las mismas herramientas. Hay algo en este enfoque que Lewis hubiera apreciado profundamente. En su libro Milagros, Lewis argumenta que el error más común al evaluar un evento sobrenatural es decidir de antemano que es imposible, y luego descartar cualquier evidencia que apunte en esa dirección. El problema, señala Lewis, es que eso no es razonamiento histórico. Es un presupuesto filosófico disfrazado de método científico. Si antes de examinar los hechos ya decidiste que los muertos no resucitan, ninguna evidencia te va a convencer, no porque la evidencia sea débil, sino porque cambiaste las reglas del juego. La honestidad intelectual exige algo diferente. Examinar los hechos primero, luego preguntar qué los explica, y estar dispuesto a seguir el argumento a donde lleve, aunque llegue a un lugar incómodo. Con eso establecido, vamos a los hechos. En las últimas décadas, un historiador y filósofo llamado Gary Habermas hizo algo meticuloso y muy poco glamoroso. Catalogó más de 3.500 artículos académicos sobre la resurrección de Jesús, escritos desde 1975, incluyendo autores de todas las tendencias, creyentes, agnósticos, ateos, críticos radicales. Y fue identificando los hechos sobre los que existe consenso amplio entre especialistas, independientemente de su posición religiosa. Lo que encontró es más sólido de lo que la mayoría espera. El primero de estos hechos es que Jesús murió por crucifixión, bajo Poncio Pilato. Este hecho está atestiguado no solo en las fuentes cristianas, sino en fuentes romanas y judías independientes, Tácito, Josefo. No hay historiadores serios que lo disputen. La muerte es el punto de partida. Sin muerte, no hay resurrección de qué hablar. El segundo hecho es que los discípulos de Jesús creyeron genuinamente haberlo visto resucitado, y esa creencia los transformó de forma radical. Esto lo acepta incluso Bart Ehrman, uno de los críticos más conocidos del cristianismo histórico, agnóstico, autor de varios libros populares contra la fe tradicional. Ehrman escribe, y es importante citarlo con precisión, que podemos decir con certeza que algunos de los discípulos de Jesús tuvieron experiencias que creyeron eran apariciones del Jesús resucitado. Ehrman no acepta que Jesús resucitó físicamente, pero sí acepta que algo ocurrió, que produjo esa convicción en personas que estuvieron allí, y aquí aparece algo que vale la pena detenerse a pensar. La transformación de esos discípulos no fue abstracta. Fueron personas que, semanas antes, habían huido despavoridas cuando arrestaron a Jesús. Pedro lo había negado 3 veces. El grupo se había dispersado. Y de repente, estas mismas personas comenzaron a proclamar públicamente que Jesús había resucitado, en Jerusalén, la misma ciudad donde había sido ejecutado, ante las mismas autoridades que lo habían crucificado. Y muchos de ellos murieron por esa proclamación. Ese cambio necesita una explicación. La gente no muere voluntariamente por algo que sabe que inventó. El tercer hecho es el caso de Pablo. Aquí el argumento se vuelve especialmente interesante. Pablo, antes llamado Saulo, no fue un discípulo de Jesús. Fue un perseguidor activo de la iglesia cristiana primitiva. Por su propia descripción, arrestaba y entregaba a los primeros cristianos. Y entonces tuvo una experiencia que él describe como un encuentro con el Jesús resucitado que lo convirtió en el propagador más importante del cristianismo en el primer siglo. Pablo no tenía ningún incentivo social, económico o político para inventar esto. Todo lo contrario. Su conversión le costó su posición, su red social y eventualmente su vida. El cuarto hecho es el de Santiago, el hermano de Jesús. Esto es quizás el hecho menos conocido pero uno de los más reveladores. Durante el ministerio de Jesús, los evangelios registran que sus hermanos no creían en él. Santiago no era seguidor. Era escéptico. Y sin embargo, después de la crucifixión, Santiago se convirtió en uno de los líderes centrales de la iglesia en Jerusalén y murió mártir por su fe en la resurrección de su hermano, que convierte a un escéptico, y específicamente al hermano de un hombre, en mártir por su causa. Los hermanos conocemos a nuestros hermanos. Los vemos en los momentos sin audiencia. Santiago no tenía ilusiones románticas sobre Jesús, tenía una razón. 4 hechos. Aceptados por especialistas de distintas posiciones. Ninguno requiere que asumas que la Biblia es infalible. Ahora viene la pregunta que lo cambia todo. Si aceptas esos 4 hechos, y la mayoría de historiadores serios los acepta, entonces necesitas una explicación para todos ellos simultáneamente. No para uno. Para todos. Y aquí es donde las teorías alternativas a la resurrección empiezan a tener problemas. Consideremos primero la teoría de la alucinación. Los discípulos estaban tan traumatizados y desesperados que alucinaron ver a Jesús. Esto podría explicar las experiencias individuales de algunos discípulos. Pero tiene un problema grave. Pablo. Las alucinaciones son fenómenos individuales cargados de deseo, uno alucina lo que quiere ver. Pablo no quería ver a Jesús. Era su enemigo activo. Además, Pablo reporta que el Cristo resucitado se apareció a más de 500 personas al mismo tiempo. Las alucinaciones colectivas masivas, entre personas que no tenían el mismo deseo ni el mismo contexto emocional, no tienen precedente en la psicología clínica. Consideremos luego la teoría del robo del cuerpo. Los discípulos robaron el cuerpo y mintieron. Esto podría explicar la tumba vacía, pero no explica la transformación de Pablo ni de Santiago. ¿Un perseguidor de la iglesia robó el cuerpo junto a los discípulos? ¿El hermano escéptico participó en el fraude? Y más fundamentalmente, la gente miente para obtener beneficios. Los discípulos no obtuvieron ningún beneficio material de esta historia. Obtuvieron persecución, exilio y ejecución. Las personas no mueren voluntariamente por algo que saben que inventaron. Existe también la teoría del coma. Jesús no murió en la cruz, sino que perdió el conocimiento y luego revivió. Esto choca con lo que sabemos sobre la crucifixión romana, un proceso diseñado específicamente para causar la muerte, con soldados entrenados que verificaban que el condenado hubiera muerto. Y además, un hombre que sobreviviera semimuerto y escapara de una tumba sellada no produciría la convicción de que venció la muerte, produciría la convicción de que sobrevivió. La diferencia teológica es enorme. Vamos a ser honestos aquí, ninguna de estas teorías es imposible en abstracto. La honestidad intelectual exige admitirlo. Lo que sí puede decirse con rigor es que ninguna explica el conjunto completo de hechos con la misma economía que la resurrección. En historia, cuando una hipótesis explica todos los datos disponibles y las alternativas tienen que multiplicar las excepciones y los casos especiales para mantenerse en pie, la primera hipótesis tiene ventaja metodológica. La conclusión que me parece inevitable y que me parece importante decir con las palabras precisas es esta. El caso histórico para la resurrección no es irrefutable. Ningún argumento histórico lo es. Pero es un caso serio, construido sobre hechos sólidos, que las alternativas no logran desmantelar sin costos argumentales importantes. Y eso es exactamente lo que el espectador necesita cuando un ateo pregunta, ¿tienes evidencia que no provenga de tu libro sagrado? La respuesta ya no es solo tengo fe. La respuesta es, tengo hechos que tú también aceptas, y una hipótesis que los explica mejor que las alternativas que tú propones. Hasta aquí, hemos construido un argumento histórico, sólido, útil, pero hay una capa más, y esta proviene de un lugar completamente inesperado. C.S. Lewis llegó a la resurrección desde un lugar completamente distinto al de un historiador o un filósofo. Y por eso su testimonio tiene un peso diferente. Lewis era experto en mitología y literatura medieval. No como hobby, sino como vocación académica de décadas. Había leído mitos nórdicos, griegos, egipcios, celtas. Conocía las historias de dioses que mueren y resucitan, Balder, Adonis, Osiris. Las amaba. Las encontraba profundamente hermosas y significativas. Y tenía un problema con el cristianismo que muchos comparten. Si esas historias de dioses moribundos resucitados son mitos, ¿por qué la historia de Jesús sería diferente? No es simplemente otro mito del mismo tipo. Fue Tolkien, su amigo, también experto en mitología, quien le ofreció una respuesta en una conversación nocturna en Oxford en septiembre de 1931 que duraría hasta las 3 de la mañana. Lo que Tolkien le dijo, en esencia, fue esto. Esas historias míticas son reflejos imperfectos de una verdad que el corazón humano ha estado buscando desde siempre. La diferencia con la historia de Jesús no es que sea un mito más, es que es el mito que ocurrió en la historia. Con coordenadas. Con testigos. Con consecuencias verificables. Lewis lo procesó durante semanas. Y cuando finalmente examinó los evangelios con sus herramientas de crítico literario, con el mismo ojo profesional que usaba para evaluar cualquier texto antiguo, encontró algo que no esperaba. Sorprendido por la alegría, Lewis escribe con una precisión que viene de alguien que realmente sabe de lo que está hablando. Era ya demasiado experimentado en crítica literaria para considerar los evangelios como mitos, porque no tenían el sabor mítico. Detente un momento y piensa en esto. Lewis no dice que los evangelios son verdad porque lo dice su fe. Dice que no son mitos, porque como experto en mitos, los mitos tienen características literarias distinguibles, una textura, un ritmo, una forma de manejar los personajes y el tiempo, que los evangelios no tienen. En cambio, los evangelios tienen la textura de la historia, nombres propios, geografía específica, detalles incómodos que ningún escritor de mitos incluiría porque dañan la narrativa heroica. Pedro negando 3 veces a su maestro. Los discípulos huyendo. Las mujeres, no los hombres, cuyo testimonio tenía peso legal en esa cultura, como primeras testigos de la tumba vacía. Y en otro ensayo, Lewis lo dice aún más directamente. Había estado leyendo poemas, romances, literatura de visiones, leyendas y mitos toda su vida, sabía cómo eran, y sabía que ninguno era como esto. Eso no es un argumento de fe, es un argumento de pericia literaria. Viene del hombre que más quería que los evangelios fueran mito, porque si eran mito, podía amarlos como amaba todos los demás mitos sin tener que hacer nada al respecto. Y en cambio encontró que no lo eran. Lo que esto añade al caso histórico es una dimensión que los números y los hechos solos no pueden dar. Los hechos te dicen que algo ocurrió. La lectura de Lewis te dice por qué la forma en que está escrito no suena a invención. Son argumentos distintos que convergen en el mismo punto. Volvamos a donde empezamos. Un ateo te pregunta, ¿tienes evidencia que no provenga de tu libro sagrado? Ahora tienes una respuesta que no necesita ese libro como punto de partida. Tienes 4 hechos que los propios especialistas críticos aceptan. La muerte de Jesús por crucifixión, la convicción genuina de los discípulos de haberlo visto resucitado, la conversión radical de Pablo, el perseguidor, y la conversión de Santiago, el hermano escéptico. Tienes un análisis de por qué las explicaciones alternativas no resuelven el conjunto de hechos sin multiplicar los problemas. Y tienes el testimonio de un experto en mitología que buscó un mito y encontró algo que su propio entrenamiento profesional no le permitía clasificar como tal. ¿Es esto prueba definitiva? No. Y vale la pena decirlo con honestidad, porque la honestidad intelectual es lo que distingue este argumento de la propaganda religiosa. La historia no produce certezas matemáticas. Lo que produce es casos más o menos sólidos, hipótesis más o menos económicas, explicaciones más o menos capaces de sostener el peso de los hechos disponibles. Lo que Lewis entendió, y esto va más allá de lo que él desarrolló explícitamente pero emerge con claridad de toda su obra apologética, es que la fe cristiana no necesita esconderse del escrutinio intelectual para sobrevivir. No necesita pedir que te desconectes de tu razón antes de creer. Necesita exactamente lo contrario. Que uses tu razón hasta el final, que sigas los argumentos a donde llevan, que no te detengas antes de tiempo porque la conclusión te incomoda. En Milagros, Lewis escribe que la primera pregunta no es si los milagros ocurrieron, sino si el universo es el tipo de lugar donde los milagros son posibles. Si respondes esa pregunta primero, los hechos históricos cobran su verdadero peso. Y si examinas los hechos históricos con honestidad, empiezan a apuntar en una dirección que es difícil ignorar. La resurrección no es donde termina la razón. Para Lewis, fue donde la razón finalmente llegó, después de años de resistencia, después de buscar todos los caminos alternativos, después de llegar a la conclusión que menos quería llegar. Y esa resistencia es exactamente lo que hace su testimonio tan valioso. No creyó porque quería creer, creyó porque las alternativas le parecieron intelectualmente más costosas. Eso es lo que hoy tienes en las manos. No una certeza que cierra todas las preguntas, sino un argumento que las abre de forma diferente, y que puede sostenerse ante un escéptico inteligente sin pedirle que abandone su razón en la puerta. Si quieres llevar este tipo de razonamiento más lejos, aplicado a las preguntas que más duelen, con herramientas concretas para cada una, el kit cristiano completo reúne 4 materiales que hacen exactamente eso. No fragmentos sueltos de apologética. Un sistema completo, diagnóstico claro de las tensiones más frecuentes entre fe e intelecto, y acción concreta en teología, espiritualidad, tecnología y relaciones familiares. Lo encuentras en el enlace de la descripción.
On obstinacy in belief. A paper read to the Socratic Club and subsequently published in the Socratic Digest and in the Sewanee Review, Volume 63, Autumn in 1955. It later appeared in The World's Last Night, US 1960, and They Asked for a Paper, 1962, and is now in Screwtape Proposes a Toast, 1998. Papers have more than once been read to the Socratic Club at Oxford, in which a contrast was drawn between a supposed Christian attitude and a supposedly scientific attitude to belief. We have been told that the scientist thinks it his duty to proportion the strength of his belief exactly to the evidence, to believe less as there is less evidence, and to withdraw belief altogether when reliable adverse evidence turns up. We have been told that, on the contrary, the Christian regards it as positively praiseworthy to believe without evidence, or in excess of the evidence, or to maintain his belief unmodified in the teeth of steadily increasing evidence against it. Thus, a faith that has stood firm, which appears to mean a belief immune from all the assaults of reality, is commended. If this were a fair statement of the case, then the coexistence within the same species of such scientists and such Christians would be a very staggering phenomenon. The fact that the two classes appear to overlap, as they do, would be quite inexplicable. Certainly, all discussion between creatures so different would be hopeless. The purpose of this essay is to show that things are really not quite so bad as that. The sense in which scientists proportion their belief to the evidence and the sense in which Christians do not, both need to be defined more closely. My hope is that when this has been done, though disagreement between the two parties may remain, they will not be left staring at one another in wholly dumb and desperate incomprehension. And first, a word about belief in general. I do not see that the state of proportioning belief to evidence is anything like so common in the scientific life as has been claimed. Scientists are mainly concerned not with believing things, but with finding things out. And no one, to the best of my knowledge, uses the word believe about things he has found out. The doctor says he believes a man was poisoned before he has examined the body. After the examination, he says the man was poisoned. No one says that he believes the multiplication table. No one who catches a thief red-handed says he believes that man was stealing. The scientist, when at work, that is, when he is a scientist, is laboring to escape from belief and unbelief into knowledge. Of course, he uses hypotheses or supposals. I do not think these are beliefs. We must look, then, for the scientist's behavior about belief, not to his scientific life, but to his leisure hours. In actual modern English usage, the verb believe, except for two special usages, generally expresses a very weak degree of opinion. Where is Tom? Gone to London, I believe. The speaker would be only mildly surprised if Tom had not gone to London after all. What was the date? 430 BC, I believe. The speaker means that he is far from sure. It is the same with the negative if it is put in the form, I believe not. Is Jones coming up this term? I believe not. But if the negative is put in a different form, then it becomes one of the special usages I mentioned a moment ago. This, of course, is the form, I don't believe it, or the still stronger, I don't believe you. I don't believe it is far stronger on the negative side than I believe is on the positive. Where is Mrs. Jones? Eloped with the butler, I believe. I don't believe it. This, especially if said with anger, may imply a conviction which, in subjective certitude, might be hard to distinguish from knowledge by experience. The other special usage is, I believe, as uttered by a Christian. There is no great difficulty in making the hardened materialist understand, however little he approves, the sort of mental attitude which this I believe expresses. The materialist need only picture himself replying to some report of a miracle, I don't believe it, and then imagine this same degree of conviction on the opposite side. He knows that he cannot, there and then, produce a refutation of the miracle which would have the certainty of mathematical demonstration. But the formal possibility that the miracle might after all have occurred does not really trouble him any more than a fear that water might not be H and O. Similarly, the Christian does not necessarily claim to have demonstrative proof, but the formal possibility that God might not exist is not necessarily present in the form of the least actual doubt. Of course, there are Christians who hold that such demonstrative proof exists, just as there may be materialists who hold that there is demonstrative disproof. But then, whichever of them is right, if either is, while he retained the proof or disproof would be not believing or disbelieving, but knowing. We are speaking of belief and disbelief in the strongest degree, but not of knowledge. Belief, in this sense, seems to me to be assent to a proposition which we think so overwhelmingly probable that there is a psychological exclusion of doubt, though not a logical exclusion of dispute. It may be asked whether belief, and of course disbelief, of this sort ever attaches to any but theological propositions. I think that many beliefs approximate to it. That is, many probabilities seem to us so strong that the absence of logical certainty does not induce in us the least shade of doubt. The scientific beliefs of those who are not themselves scientists often have this character, especially among the uneducated. Most of our beliefs about other people are of the same sort. The scientist himself, or he who was a scientist in the laboratory, has beliefs about his wife and friends which he holds, not indeed without evidence, but with more certitude than the evidence, if weighed in the laboratory manner, would justify. Most of my generation had a belief in the reality of the external world and of other people, if you prefer it, a disbelief in solipsism, far in excess of our strongest arguments. It may be true, as they now say, that the whole thing arose from category mistakes and was a pseudo-problem. But then we didn't know that in the 20s. Yet we managed to disbelieve in solipsism all the same. There is, of course, no question so far of belief without evidence. We must beware of confusion between the way in which a Christian first assents to certain propositions and the way in which he afterwards adheres to them. These must be carefully distinguished. Of the second, it is true, in a sense, to say that Christians do recommend a certain discounting of apparent contrary evidence, and I will later attempt to explain why. But so far as I know, it is not expected that a man should assent to these propositions in the first place without evidence, or in the teeth of the evidence. At any rate, if anyone expects that, I certainly do not. And in fact, the man who accepts Christianity always thinks he has good evidence, whether, like Dante, physici e metaphysici argumenti, or historical evidence, or the evidence of religious experience, or authority, or all these together. For of course authority, however we may value it in this or that particular instance, is a kind of evidence. All of our historical beliefs, most of our geographical beliefs, many of our beliefs about matter that concern us in daily life, are accepted on the authority of other human beings, whether we are Christians, atheists, scientists, or men in the street. It is not the purpose of this essay to weigh the evidence of whatever kind on which Christians base their belief. To do that would be to write a full-dress apologia. All that I need do here is to point out that, at the very worst, this evidence cannot be so weak as to warrant the view that all whom it convinces are indifferent to evidence. The history of thought seems to make this quite plain. We know, in fact, that believers are not cut off from unbelievers by any portentous inferiority of intelligence, or any perverse refusal to think. Many of them have been people of powerful minds. Many of them have been scientists. We may suppose them to have been mistaken, but we must suppose that their error was at least plausible. We might indeed conclude that it was, merely from the multitude and diversity of the arguments against it. For there is not one case against religion, but many. Some say, like Coppenius and Statius, that it is a projection of our primitive fears. Primus in orbe Deus fecit timor. Others, with Euhemerus, that it is all a plant put up by wicked kings, priests, or capitalists. Others, with Tylor, that it comes from dreams about the dead. Others, with Fraser, that it is a byproduct of agriculture. Others, like Freud, that it is a complex. The moderns, that it is a category mistake. I will never believe that an error against which so many and various defensive weapons have been found necessary was, from the outset, wholly lacking in plausibility. All this post-haste and rummage in the land obviously implies a respectable enemy. There are, of course, people in our own day to whom the whole situation seems altered by the doctrine of the concealed wish. They will admit that men, otherwise apparently rational, have been deceived by the arguments for religion. But they will say that they have been deceived first by their own desires and produced the arguments afterwards as a rationalization. That these arguments have never been intrinsically even plausible, but have seemed so because they were secretly weighted by our wishes. And now I do not doubt that this sort of thing happens in thinking about religion as in thinking about other things. But as a general explanation of religious assent, it seems to me quite useless. On that issue, our wishes may favor either side or both. The assumption that every man would be pleased, and nothing but pleased, if only he could conclude that Christianity is true, appears to me to be simply preposterous. If Freud is right about the Oedipus complex, the universal pressure of the wish that God should not exist must be enormous, and atheism must be an admirable gratification to one of our strongest suppressed impulses. This argument, in fact, could be used on the theistic side, but I have no intention of so using it. It will not really help either party. It is fatally ambivalent. Men wish on both sides. And again, there is fear fulfillment as well as wish fulfillment, and hypochondriac temperaments will always tend to think true what they most wish to be false. Thus, instead of the one predicament on which our opponents sometimes concentrate, there are in fact four. A man may be a Christian because he wants Christianity to be true. He may be an atheist because he wants atheism to be true. He may be an atheist because he wants Christianity to be true. He may be a Christian because he wants atheism to be true. Surely these possibilities cancel one another out. They may be of some use in analyzing a particular instance of belief or disbelief, where we know the case history, but as a general explanation of either they will not help us. I do not think they overthrow the view that there is evidence both for and against the Christian propositions, which fully rational minds, working honestly, can assess differently. I therefore ask you to substitute a different and less tidy picture for that with which we began. In it, you remember, two different kinds of men, scientists, who proportioned their belief to the evidence, and Christians, who did not, were left facing one another across a chasm. The picture I should prefer is like this. All men alike, on questions which interest them, escape from the region of belief into that of knowledge when they can, and if they succeed in knowing, they no longer say they believe. The questions in which mathematicians are interested admit of treatment by a particularly clear and strict technique. Those of the scientist have their own technique, which is not quite the same. Those of the historian and the judge are different again. The mathematician's proof, at least so we laymen suppose, is by reasoning, the scientists by experiment, the historians by documents, the judges by concurring sworn testimony. But all these men, as men, on questions outside their own disciplines, have numerous beliefs to which they do not normally apply the methods of their own disciplines. It would indeed carry some suspicion of morbidity and even of insanity if they did. These beliefs vary in strength from weak opinion to complete subjective certitude. Specimens of such beliefs at the strongest are the Christians, I believe, and the convinced atheists, I don't believe a word of it. The particular subject matter on which these two disagree does not, of course, necessarily involve such strength of belief and disbelief. There are some who moderately opine that there is, or is not, a God. But there are others whose belief or disbelief is free from doubt. And all these beliefs, weak or strong, are based on what appears to the holders to be evidence. But the strong believers or disbelievers, of course, think they have very strong evidence. There is no need to suppose stark unreason on either side. We need only suppose error. One side has estimated the evidence wrongly. And even so, the mistake cannot be supposed to be of a flagrant nature. Otherwise the debate would not continue. So much, then, for the way in which Christians come to assent to certain propositions. But we have now to consider something quite different, their adherence to their belief after it has once been formed. It is here that the charge of irrationality and resistance to evidence becomes really important. For it must be admitted at once that Christians do praise such an adherence as if it were meritorious. And even, in a sense, more meritorious the stronger the apparent evidence against their faith becomes. They even warn one another that such apparent contrary evidence, such trials to faith or temptations to doubt, may be expected to occur, and determine in advance to resist them. And this is certainly shockingly unlike the behavior we all demand of the scientist or the historian in their own disciplines. There, to slur over or ignore the faintest evidence against a favorite hypothesis is admittedly foolish and shameful. It must be exposed to every test. Every doubt must be invited. But then, I do not admit that a hypothesis is a belief. And if we consider the scientist not among his hypotheses in the laboratory, but among the beliefs in his ordinary life, I think the contrast between him and the Christian would be weakened. If, for the first time, a doubt of his wife's fidelity crosses the scientist's mind, does he consider it his duty at once to entertain this doubt with complete impartiality, at once to evolve a series of experiments by which it can be tested, and to await the result with pure neutrality of mind? No doubt it may come to that in the end. There are unfaithful wives. There are experimental husbands. But is such a course what his brother scientists would recommend to him? All of them, I suppose, except one, as the first step he should take, and the only one consistent with his honor as a scientist. Or would they, like us, blame him for a moral flaw, rather than praise him for an intellectual virtue if he did so? This is intended, however, merely as a precaution against exaggerating the difference between Christian obstinacy in belief and the behavior of normal people about their non-theological beliefs. I am far from suggesting that the case I have supposed is exactly parallel to the Christian obstinacy. For, of course, evidence of the wife's infidelity might accumulate, and presently reach a point at which the scientist would be pitiably foolish to disbelieve it. But the Christians seem to praise an adherence to the original belief which holds out against any evidence whatever. I must now try to show why such praise is, in fact, a logical conclusion from the original belief itself. This can be done best by thinking for a moment of situations in which the thing is reversed. In Christianity, such faith is demanded of us, but there are situations in which we demand it of others. There are times when we can do all that a fellow creature needs, if only he will trust us. In getting a dog out of a trap, in extracting a thorn from a child's finger, in teaching a boy to swim or rescuing one who can't, in getting a frightened beginner over a nasty place on a mountain, the one fatal obstacle may be their distrust. We are asking them to trust us in the teeth of their senses, their imagination, and their intelligence. We ask them to believe that what is painful will relieve their pain, and that what looks dangerous is their only safety. We ask them to accept apparent impossibilities, that moving the paw further back into the trap is the way to get it out, that hurting the finger very much more will stop the finger hurting, that water, which is obviously permeable, will resist and support the body, that holding on to the only support within reach is not the way to avoid sinking, that to go higher and onto a more exposed ledge is the way not to fall. To support all these incredibilia, we can rely only on the other party's confidence in us. A confidence certainly not based on demonstration, admittedly shot through with emotion, and perhaps, if we are strangers, resting on nothing but such assurance as the look of our face and the tone of our voice can supply, or even, for the dog, on our smell. Sometimes, because of their unbelief, we can do no mighty works. But if we succeed, we do so because they have maintained their faith in us against apparently contrary evidence. No one blames us for demanding such faith. No one blames them for giving it. No one says afterwards, what an unintelligent dog or child or boy that must have been to trust us. If the young mountaineer were a scientist, it would not be held against him, when he came up for a fellowship, that he had once departed from Clifford's rule of evidence by entertaining a belief with strength greater than the evidence logically obliged him to. Now, to accept the Christian propositions is, ipso facto, to believe that we are to God, always, as that dog, or child, or bather, or mountain climber was to us, only very much more so. From this, it is a strictly logical conclusion that the behavior which was appropriate to them will be appropriate to us, only very much more so. Mark, I am not saying that the strength of our original belief must, by psychological necessity, produce such behavior. I am saying that the content of our original belief, by logical necessity, entails the proposition that such behavior is appropriate. If human life is, in fact, ordered by a beneficent being, whose knowledge of our real needs and of the way in which they can be satisfied infinitely exceeds our own, we must expect, a priori, that his operations will often appear to us far from beneficent and far from wise, and that it will be our highest prudence to give him our confidence in spite of this. This expectation is increased by the fact that when we accept Christianity, we are warned that apparent evidence against it will occur, evidence strong enough to deceive, if possible, the very elect. Our situation is rendered tolerable by two facts. One is that we seem to ourselves, besides the apparently contrary evidence, to receive favourable evidence. Some of it is in the form of external events, as when I go to see a man, moved by what I felt to be a whim, and find he has been praying that I should come to him that day. Some of it is more like the evidence on which the mountaineer or the dog might trust his rescuer. The rescuer's voice, look, and smell. For it seems to us, though you and your premises must believe us deluded, that we have something like a knowledge by acquaintance of the person we believe in, however imperfect and intermittent it may be. We trust not because a God exists, but because this God exists. Or if we ourselves dare not claim to know him, Christendom does, and we trust at least some of its representatives in the same way, because of the sort of people they are. The second fact is this. We think we can see already why, if our original belief is true, such trust beyond the evidence against much apparent evidence has to be demanded of us. For the question is not about being helped out of one trap or over one difficult place in a climb. We believe that his intention is to create a certain personal relation between himself and us, a relation really sui generis, but analogically describable in terms of filial or of erotic love. Complete trust is an ingredient in that relation, such trust as could have no room to grow except where there is also room for doubt. To love involves trusting the beloved beyond the evidence, even against much evidence. No man is our friend who believes in our good intentions only when they are proved. No man is our friend who will not be very slow to accept evidence against them. Such confidence between one man and another is in fact almost universally praised as a moral beauty, not blamed as a logical error. And the suspicious man is blamed for a meanness of character, not admired for the excellence of his logic. There is, you see, no real parallel between Christian obstinacy and faith and the obstinacy of a bad scientist trying to preserve a hypothesis although the evidence has turned against it. Unbelievers very pardonably get the impression that an adherence to our faith is like that, because they meet Christianity, if at all, mainly in apologetic works. And there, of course, the existence and beneficence of God must appear as a speculative question like any other. Indeed, it is a speculative question as long as it is a question at all. But once it has been answered in the affirmative, you get quite a new situation. To believe that God, at least this God, exists, is to believe that you, as a person, now stand in the presence of God as a person. What would, a moment before, have been variations in opinion, now becomes variations in your personal attitude to a person. You are no longer faced with an argument which demands your assent, but with a person who demands your confidence. A faint analogy would be this. It is one thing to discuss in vacuo whether so-and-so will join us tonight, and another to discuss this when so-and-so's honour is pledged to come and some great matter depends on his coming. In the first case, it would be merely reasonable, as the clock ticked on, to expect him less and less. In the second, a continued expectation far into the night would be due to our friend's character if we had found him reliable before. Which of us would not feel slightly ashamed if 1 moment after we had given him up he arrived with a full explanation of his delay? We should feel that we ought to have known him better. Now, of course, we see, quite as clearly as you, how agonizingly two-edged all this is. A faith of this sort, if it happens to be true, is obviously what we need, and it is infinitely ruinous to lack it. But there can be faith of this sort where it is wholly ungrounded. The dog may lick the face of the man who comes to take it out of the trap, but the man may only mean to vivisect it in South Park's Road when he has done so. The ducks who come to the call, "Dilly, dilly, come and be killed," have confidence in the farmer's wife, and she wrings their necks for their pains. There is that famous French story of the fire in the theatre. Panic was spreading. The spectators were just turning from an audience into a mob. At that moment, a huge, bearded man leaped through the orchestra onto the stage, raised his hand with a gesture full of nobility, and cried, "Que chacun regagne sa place." Such was the authority of his voice and bearing that everyone obeyed him. As a result, they were all burned to death, while the bearded man walked quietly out through the wings to the stage door, took a cab which was waiting for someone else, and went home to bed. That demand for our confidence which a true friend makes of us is exactly the same that a confidence trickster would make. That refusal to trust, which is sensible in reply to a confidence trickster, is ungenerous and ignoble to a friend, and deeply damaging to our relation with him. To be forewarned, and therefore forearmed against apparently contrary appearance, is eminently rational if our belief is true. But if our belief is a delusion, this same forewarning and forearming would obviously be the method whereby the delusion rendered itself incurable. And yet again, to be aware of these possibilities and still to reject them is clearly the precise mode and the only mode in which our personal response to God can establish itself. In that sense, the ambiguity is not something that conflicts with faith so much as a condition which makes faith possible. When you are asked for trust, you may give it or withhold it. It is senseless to say that you will trust if you are given demonstrative certainty. There would be no room for trust if demonstration were given. When demonstration is given, what will be left will be simply the sort of relation which results from having trusted or not having trusted before it was given. The saying, "Blessed are those that have not seen and have believed," has nothing to do with our original assent to the Christian propositions. It was not addressed to a philosopher inquiring whether God exists. It was addressed to a man who already believed that, who already had long acquaintance with a particular person, and evidence that that person could do very odd things, and who then refused to believe one odd thing more, often predicted by that person and vouched for by all his closest friends. It is a rebuke not to skepticism in the philosophic sense, but to the psychological quality of being suspicious. It says in effect, "You should have known me better." There are cases between man and man where we should all, in our different way, bless those who have not seen and have believed. Our relation to those who trusted us only after we were proved innocent in court cannot be the same as our relation to those who trusted us all through. Our opponents, then, have a perfect right to dispute with us about the grounds of our original assent, but they must not accuse us of sheer insanity if, after the assent has been given, our adherence to it is no longer proportioned to every fluctuation of the apparent evidence. They cannot, of course, be expected to know on what our assurance feeds, and how it revives, and is always rising from its ashes. They cannot be expected to see how the quality of the object which we think we are beginning to know by acquaintance drives us to the view that if this were a delusion, then we should have to say that the universe had produced no real thing of comparable value, and that all explanations of the delusion seemed somehow less important than the thing explained. That is knowledge we cannot communicate. But they can see how the assent, of necessity, moves us from the logic of speculative thought into what might perhaps be called the logic of personal relations. What would, up till then, have been variations simply of opinion, become variations of conduct by a person to a person. Credere Deum esse turns into credere in Deum, and Deum here is this God, the increasingly knowable Lord. 85. Bulverism, or the foundation of 20th century thought. This first appeared as Notes on the Way in Time and Tide, Volume 22, 29th of March 1941, and was published in an expanded form as Bulverism, or the Foundation of 20th Century Thought, in the Socratic Digest No. 2, June 1944. It was then reproduced in Undeceptions, 1971, and is now in Compelling Reason, 1998. It is a disastrous discovery, as Emerson says somewhere, that we exist. I mean, it is disastrous when, instead of merely attending to a rose, we are forced to think of ourselves looking at the rose, with a certain type of mind and a certain type of eyes. It is disastrous because, if you are not very careful, the colour of the rose gets attributed to our optic nerves and it's sent to our noses, and in the end there is no rose left. The professional philosophers have been bothered about this universal blackout for over 200 years, and the world has not much listened to them. But the same disaster is now occurring on a level we can all understand. We have recently discovered that we exist in two senses. The Freudians have discovered that we exist as bundles of complexes. The Marxians have discovered that we exist as members of some economic class. In the old days, it was supposed that if a thing seemed obviously true to 100 men, then it was probably true in fact. Nowadays, the Freudian will tell you to go and analyze the 100. You will find that they all think Elizabeth I a great queen, because they all have a mother complex. Their thoughts are psychologically tainted at the source. and the Marxist will tell you to go and examine the economic interests of the 100. You will find that they all think freedom a good thing because they are all members of the bourgeoisie whose prosperity is increased by a policy of laissez-faire. Their thoughts are ideologically tainted at the source. Now this is obviously great fun, but it has not always been noticed that there is a bill to pay for it. There are two questions that people who say this kind of thing ought to be asked. The first is, are all thoughts thus tainted at the source, or only some? The second is, does the taint invalidate the tainted thought, in the sense of making it untrue, or not? If they say that all thoughts are thus tainted, then of course we must remind them that Freudianism and Marxism are as much systems of thought as Christian theology or philosophical idealism. The Freudian and the Marxian are in the same boat with all the rest of us, and cannot criticize us from outside. They have sawn off the branch they were sitting on. If, on the other hand, they say that the taint need not invalidate their thinking, then neither need it invalidate ours, in which case they have saved their own branch, but also saved ours along with it. The only line they can really take is to say that some thoughts are tainted and others are not, which has the advantage, if Freudians and Marxians regard it as an advantage, of being what every sane man has always believed. But if that is so, we must then ask how you find out which are tainted and which are not. It is no earthly use saying that those are tainted which agree with the secret wishes of the thinker. Some of the things I should like to believe must, in fact, be true. It is impossible to arrange a universe which contradicts everyone's wishes in every respect at every moment. Suppose I think, after doing my accounts, that I have a large balance at the bank. And suppose you want to find out whether this belief of mine is wishful thinking. You can never come to any conclusion by examining my psychological condition. Your only chance of finding out is to sit down and work through the sum yourself. When you have checked my figures, then, and then only, will you know whether I have that balance or not. If you find my arithmetic correct, then no amount of vaporing about my psychological condition can be anything but a waste of time. If you find my arithmetic wrong, then it may be relevant to explain psychologically how I came to be so bad at my arithmetic, and the doctrine of the concealed wish will become relevant. But only after you have yourself done the sum and discovered me to be wrong on purely arithmetical grounds. It is the same with all thinking and all systems of thought. If you try to find out which are tainted by speculating about the wishes of the thinkers, you are merely making a fool of yourself. You must find out on purely logical grounds which of them do, in fact, break down as arguments. Afterwards, if you like, go on and discover the psychological causes of the error. In other words, you must show that a man is wrong before you start explaining why he is wrong. The modern method is to assume without discussion that he is wrong, and then distract his attention from this, the only real issue, by busily explaining how he became so silly. In the course of the last 15 years, I have found this vice so common that I have had to invent a name for it. I call it Bulverism. Some day I am going to write the biography of its imaginary inventor, Ezekiel Bulver, whose destiny was determined at the age of 5 when he heard his mother say to his father, who had been maintaining that 2 sides of a triangle were together greater than the third, "Oh, you say that because you are a man." At that moment, E. Bulver assures us, there flashed across my opening mind the great truth that refutation is no necessary part of argument. Assume that your opponent is wrong, and then explain his error, and the world will be at your feet. Attempt to prove that he is wrong, or, worse still, try to find out whether he is wrong or right, and the national dynamism of our age will thrust you to the wall. That is how Bulver became one of the makers of the 20th century. I find the fruits of his discovery almost everywhere. Thus I see my religion dismissed on the grounds that the comfortable parson had every reason for assuring the 19th century worker that poverty would be rewarded in another world. Well, no doubt he had. On the assumption that Christianity is an error, I can see easily enough that some people would still have a motive for inculcating it. I see it so easily that I can, of course, play the game the other way round, by saying that the modern man has every reason for trying to convince himself that there are no eternal sanctions behind the morality he is rejecting. For Bulverism is a truly democratic game, in the sense that all can play it all day long, and that it gives no unfair privilege to the small and offensive minority who reason. But, of course, it gets us not 1 inch nearer to deciding whether, as a matter of fact, the Christian religion is true or false. That question remains to be discussed on quite different grounds, a matter of philosophical and historical argument. However it were decided, the improper motives of some people, both for believing it and for disbelieving it, would remain just as they are. I see Bulverism at work in every political argument. The capitalists must be bad economists because we know why they want capitalism. And equally, the communists must be bad economists because we know why they want communism. Thus, the Bulverists on both sides. In reality, of course, either the doctrines of the capitalists are false or the doctrines of the communists, or both. But you can only find out the rights and wrongs by reasoning, never by being rude about your opponent's psychology. Until Bulverism is crushed, reason can play no effective part in human affairs. Each side snatches it early as a weapon against the other. But between the two, reason itself is discredited. And why should reason not be discredited? It would be easy, in answer, to point to the present state of the world. But the real answer is even more immediate. The forces discrediting reason themselves depend on reasoning. You must reason even to Bulverize. You are trying to prove that all proofs are invalid. If you fail, you fail. If you succeed, then you fail even more. For the proof that all proofs are invalid must be invalid itself. The alternative, then, is either sheer self-contradicting idiocy, or else some tenacious belief in our power of reasoning, held in the teeth of all the evidence that Bulverists can bring for a taint in this or that human reasoner. I am ready to admit, if you like, that this tenacious belief has something transcendental or mystical about it. What then? Would you rather be a lunatic than a mystic? So we see there is no justification for holding on to our belief in reason. But can this be done without theism? Does I know involve that God exists? Everything I know is an inference from sensation, except the present moment. All our knowledge of the universe beyond our immediate experiences depends on inferences from these experiences. If our inferences do not give a genuine insight into reality, then we can know nothing. A theory cannot be accepted if it does not allow our thinking to be a genuine insight, nor if the fact of our knowledge is not explicable in terms of that theory. But our thoughts can only be accepted as a genuine insight under certain conditions. All beliefs have causes, but a distinction must be drawn between 1. Ordinary causes, and 2. A special kind of cause called a reason. Causes are mindless events which can produce other results than belief. Reasons arise from axioms and inferences and affect only beliefs. Bulverism tries to show that the other man has causes and not reasons, and that we have reasons and not causes. A belief which can be accounted for entirely in terms of causes is worthless. This principle must not be abandoned when we consider the beliefs which are the basis of others. Our knowledge depends on our certainty about axioms and inferences. If these are the result of causes, then there is no possibility of knowledge. Either we can know nothing, or thought has reasons only and no causes.
Sometimes in life a woman must stand alone, not because she wants to, but because her path requires a different strength. A strength rooted not in crowds, but in silence. Society often pushes us to seek validation through friendships and popularity, convincing us that we need others to prove our worth. But a woman who walks alone finds her worth from within and from God, not from the opinions or support of others. In Psalm 46:5 we read, "God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. This verse reminds us that real strength is found in God's presence. When He is within her, she can stand firm, even when others fall away. Today we'll explore the powerful qualities of a woman who walks alone. But before we continue, please give this video a thumbs up so we can keep sharing these messages. Let us dive in. There's a unique strength in walking alone, especially for a woman. Independence and self-sufficiency aren't qualities that just appear. They're forged over time, through experiences, trials, and often solitude. A woman who chooses to stand on her own feet without needing the approval of others isn't just surviving, she's thriving. Her strength comes not from those around her, but from within. Our society tends to glorify companionship and togetherness, as though having people constantly by your side is what determines your worth. But a woman who walks alone has discovered that true power lies in self-reliance. She doesn't need a crowd or a tribe to define her purpose or give her direction. Instead, she learns to lean on God, knowing that He alone can supply the strength she needs. This self-sufficiency isn't about rejecting relationships. It's about understanding that relationships don't define her. She knows that she doesn't need friends or validation to know her worth, because her worth is something that is defined by God. Psalm 46:5 tells us, God is within hers, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. In this verse we see the essence of her strength. She doesn't rely on what people can give her. She relies on what God has already placed within her. When she faces challenges, she doesn't run to others for answers or support. She looks within, trusting her instincts, her resilience, and her experience. She has built this strength over time, and it has set her apart. She doesn't fall apart when people leave her, or when circumstances become difficult. Instead, she taps into a deep well of resilience. She understands that the only person she can truly count on, besides God, is herself, and that knowledge gives her unbreakable confidence. This kind of resilience isn't just about enduring, it's about thriving. She has learned to navigate life without constantly needing the affirmation or approval of others. She makes her own decisions, shapes her life, and stands strong in her beliefs, values, and vision. Walking alone requires courage, but it also grants her freedom. It's easy to follow the crowd, to be swept up in what everyone else is doing. But a woman who is self-sufficient is more interested in what's right for her than what's easy. She has the self-awareness and confidence to make choices that align with her true self, even if those choices take her down a solitary path. Through this independence, she finds a new kind of strength, a strength that isn't shaken by the absence of people. Her inner strength grows in her solitude, a power that doesn't waver, no matter who comes or goes. For a woman like this, solitude is not an empty space. It's a source of empowerment. It allows her to focus on herself, on her purpose, and on her walk with God. Write in the comments, "I walk with God," to declare that He is your firm foundation. Think of Ruth, who stood alone after her husband died and chose to leave her homeland to stay by Naomi's side. Ruth walked a path of solitude and uncertainty, yet her strength was unwavering because it was rooted in her loyalty, her determination, and her trust in God. In the same way, a woman who values her independence knows that walking alone doesn't make her weak. It makes her strong, self-reliant, and filled with a sense of purpose that doesn't need validation. When God is within her, she knows she will not fall because her strength comes from Him. In solitude, she has space to reflect, to grow, and to listen to God's voice. And in that quiet, she realizes that her worth and strength are gifts that only He can give. In a world that's constantly measuring us by the people around us, A woman who walks alone has learned something rare and powerful. She knows her worth. Her value isn't defined by how many friends she has, how popular she is, or how many people seek her out. Her worth is something she has discovered deep within, and it doesn't waver based on anyone else's opinion or approval. Society often tells us that we need others to validate us, to make us feel important. But a woman who understands her worth knows that no person can determine her value. She's found that her worth is a reflection of her relationship with God, of who He says she is. In 1 Peter 2:9, we're reminded, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession." This verse is her foundation, reminding her that she is precious in God's eyes. No one else's opinion matters when she knows that she's chosen, valued, and loved by her Creator. This understanding of self-worth frees her from the pressure to conform or to please others just for the sake of acceptance. She isn't looking for validation in the eyes of people who don't truly see her. Instead, she's learned to define herself by her own values, her faith, and her unique purpose. This kind of confidence allows her to live authentically, without feeling the need to prove herself to anyone. For a woman who knows her worth, relationships are not about filling a void or proving her value. She values quality over quantity, knowing that true friendship is rare and takes time. She's patient, waiting for connections that are meaningful, supportive, and uplifting. She would rather walk alone than surround herself with people who don't align with her values. A woman who knows her worth doesn't fear solitude because her worth is not based on how many people are around her. She understands that her identity is rooted in God's love, not in social approval. This mindset gives her a deep inner peace. She isn't rushing into relationships or clinging to people out of insecurity. She has the wisdom to recognize when a relationship is no longer healthy or supportive, and she's unafraid to walk away. She doesn't fear letting go because she knows that her value remains intact, no matter who stays or goes. Her worth is unshakable, grounded in her identity as God's beloved. In valuing herself, she sets healthy boundaries. She isn't willing to compromise her peace or integrity just to fit in or be accepted. She knows her worth, and so she's selective about who has access to her life. Her self-worth acts as a filter, allowing her to choose relationships that uplift her and bring out her best. She doesn't chase popularity or the appearance of having a large circle. She seeks depth, truth, and authenticity. A woman who knows her worth also has a unique strength to stand firm in her values. She isn't easily swayed by others' opinions or by the pressure to conform. Her self-respect gives her the courage to say no when necessary and to hold true to her convictions. She knows that pleasing people isn't her purpose. Pleasing God is. Her goal isn't to blend in, but to live out her calling in a way that honors who she is and the path God has laid before her. Think about the story of Queen Esther. She risked her life to stand before the king, not for her own gain, but for a purpose far greater than herself. She knew her worth didn't come from her title as queen or the approval of those around her. Her worth was found in her God-given purpose, and that knowledge gave her the strength to act with courage, even when the stakes were high. In the same way, a woman who knows her worth doesn't settle for less than what aligns with her values and calling. She's willing to walk a lonely path if that's what it takes to live authentically, and to honor her identity in Christ. Her self-worth is her guide, helping her make decisions that reflect who she truly is. This understanding of her worth also means that she takes care of herself, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. She prioritizes self-care, not out of vanity, but as a way to honor the value God has placed in her. She sees herself as worthy of respect, of peace, and of love, and so she invests in her well-being. She's learned that taking care of herself is a reflection of her gratitude for the life God has given her. So when a woman understands her worth, she doesn't seek it in the approval of others. She finds it in God's presence, in the quiet assurance that she is enough just as she is. She doesn't need others to validate her or make her feel important because she already knows her value. And that knowledge gives her a kind of freedom, a freedom to live authentically, to set boundaries, and to walk away from anything that doesn't align with her worth. In the end, a woman who knows her worth has a deep, unshakable sense of identity. She's anchored in the truth that she is loved by God, chosen, and called for a purpose. Her life becomes a testimony to others that true worth isn't found in people or in popularity, but in God's love and purpose for her life. One of the most remarkable qualities of a woman who walks alone is her unwavering trust in God's guidance. Without the constant input of others or the comfort of a crowd, she has learned to lean into God for direction. She understands that while others may have good intentions, no one's guidance can compare to the wisdom, strength, and clarity that come from God. In her solitude, she discovers that God is her closest companion and her most reliable guide. This trust doesn't develop overnight. It grows out of seasons of dependence on God, seasons where she has had to walk paths that felt uncertain, even lonely, but where she learned to listen for His voice. When she faces decisions, challenges, or moments of doubt, she doesn't rush to seek approval or advice from people around her. Instead, she turns to God in prayer, inviting Him to lead her. Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 speaks to this dependence on God. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. A woman who trusts in God's guidance doesn't need constant reassurance from others because she has learned to find her security in God's presence. She understands that people may change, circumstances may shift, but God's faithfulness is a constant. This truth gives her a confidence that isn't easily shaken. She trusts that God's plans for her are good and that He will direct her steps, even if the path isn't always clear. In solitude, she has learned the importance of hearing God's voice. Life is filled with noise, opinions, expectations, and the constant stream of information from the world around us. But solitude creates space for clarity. A woman who walks alone often has fewer distractions, allowing her to develop a sensitivity to God's guidance. She knows that in the quiet God speaks, and she treasures those moments when she can hear Him without interruption. This practice of listening for God's direction gives her a sense of purpose and confidence in her choices. She no longer needs to look around at what everyone else is doing. Instead, she is focused on what God is calling her to do. She is content with God's unique purpose for her, even if it looks different from the paths others are taking. Her trust in God isn't selective. She doesn't only lean on Him in moments of crisis or when she is at a loss. Her dependence on God is woven into every area of her life. When faced with decisions, she prays for wisdom and direction. When confronted with challenges, she asks for strength and peace. Her relationship with God is her foundation, and from that foundation she finds the courage to keep going, knowing she is never alone. The story of Mary, the mother of Jesus, is a beautiful example of this kind of faith. When the angel told Mary that she would bear the Son of God, she was undoubtedly filled with uncertainty, questions, and perhaps even fear. But her response was simple and full of trust. "I am the Lord's servant," she said. "May your word to me be fulfilled." Luke 1:38. Mary didn't rely on the approval or understanding of others. She put her trust in God's plan, even when it seemed beyond her comprehension. Like Mary, a woman who trusts God's guidance moves forward with faith, even when she doesn't have all the answers. One of the hardest parts of trusting God's guidance is learning to prioritize His voice over the opinions and judgments of others. A woman who walks alone often faces criticism or misunderstanding because her path looks different from what people expect. But instead of bending to the opinions of others, she stays true to what she knows God has placed in her heart. She understands that the approval of people is fleeting, but the approval of God is eternal. This willingness to follow God's direction, even when others don't understand, takes courage. She may choose a career, a lifestyle, or a ministry path that others don't understand or support. But her confidence isn't rooted in human understanding. It's rooted in her relationship with God. She knows that following God's will is always worth any discomfort, misunderstanding, or isolation she might face along the way. Consider the story of Deborah, the prophet and judge in Israel. Deborah trusted God's guidance, even when it meant stepping into a role that was uncommon for women at the time. She led with authority, wisdom, and a deep sense of God's purpose, even when others might have questioned her place. Like Deborah, a woman who trusts God's guidance finds strength in knowing that God has uniquely equipped her for her calling, regardless of what others might think. Trusting in God's guidance often means walking by faith, not by sight. A woman who chooses to walk alone learns to embrace this truth because she knows that God's plans are often bigger than what she can see or understand in the moment. She has faith that even when the path looks uncertain, God is working behind the scenes, aligning everything for her good. This kind of faith doesn't mean she never experiences doubt or fear. She's human after all, but in moments of uncertainty, she reminds herself of God's promises and clings to His word. She trusts that God's timing is perfect, that He sees what she cannot, and that His plans for her are good, even when they don't align with her own expectations. Her life becomes a testament to 2 Corinthians 5:7. For we walk by faith, not by sight. She doesn't need to see the whole picture to trust that God is guiding her. Part of trusting God's guidance is learning to surrender control. A woman who walks alone often has learned to be strong and self-sufficient, but she also knows the importance of yielding to God's will. Trusting in God means letting go of her own plans and embracing His, even if they look different from what she envisioned. She has discovered that true peace comes not from controlling every aspect of her life, but from resting in the knowledge that God is in control. This surrender is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom. She knows that God's wisdom is higher than hers and that His perspective is eternal. By placing her trust in Him, she experiences a peace that only comes from surrender. Her faith grows as she learns to let go, recognizing that God's plans are far greater than anything she could orchestrate on her own. In trusting God's guidance, a woman finds that her life has a deep sense of purpose. She doesn't need to chase after others' paths or conform to societal expectations because she's focused on fulfilling her God-given calling. Her choices reflect her faith, and she is intentional about where she invests her time, energy, and heart. This kind of trust transforms her life from one of mere survival to one of significance. She lives each day with purpose because she knows that God is directing her steps. Her faith fuels her actions, and her actions bear witness to her trust in God. She is an example to others of what it looks like to live a life led by faith rather than by fear, to move forward with confidence because she knows who goes before her. When a woman walks alone, Her journey may look different, even challenging, but it's one marked by trust. She has placed her confidence in God's guidance, not in her own understanding or the opinions of others. Her strength, her identity, and her purpose all flow from her relationship with Him. She walks by faith, allowing God to shape her path, knowing that as long as He is leading, she is exactly where she needs to be. In the end, her trust in God is what sustains her, empowers her, and sets her apart. She is strong, wise, and confident, not because she has all the answers, but because she knows the one who does. She trusts that He is guiding her every step, and in that trust she finds her peace, her purpose, and her true freedom. As we've seen, a woman who walks alone carries a strength, self-worth, and a deep trust in God that make her resilient and unshakable. Her strength isn't defined by the people around her, but by the one who lives within her. Her worth isn't dependent on societal standards or the approval of others. It's rooted in her identity as God's beloved. And her path is guided not by popular opinion, but by her unwavering trust in God's wisdom and faithfulness. And for the woman who walks alone, her journey isn't one of isolation or self-sufficiency. Instead, it's a journey of resilience, purpose, and peace, anchored in her relationship with God. She is never without companionship, for God is always beside her, guiding her, and strengthening her for the journey ahead. Let this be an encouragement for all of us, whether we walk alone or in the company of others. Seek strength in God, know your worth in His love, and trust in His unfailing guidance. May we all find the courage to walk boldly and confidently, knowing that as long as God is with us, we will never walk alone.
Aspects of faith. 10. Christianity and Culture. This collection of 3 articles was Lewis's part in a series of 5 papers first published in Theology, volumes 40 and 41, March-December 1940. It is now in Christian Reflections, 1998. The other writers were S. L. Bethel and E. F. Carrett, Replies to Mr. Lewis, and George Every, In Defense of Criticism. If the heavenly life is not grown up in you, it signifies nothing what you have chosen in the stead of it, or why you have chosen it. William Law. 1. At an early age I came to believe that the life of culture, that is, of intellectual and aesthetic activity, was very good for its own sake, or even that it was good for man. After my conversion, which occurred in my later 20s, I continued to hold this belief without consciously asking how it could be reconciled with my new belief that the end of human life was salvation in Christ and the glorifying of God. I was awakened from this confused state of mind by finding that the friends of culture seemed to me to be exaggerating. In my reaction against what seemed exaggerated, I was driven to the other extreme, and began, in my own mind, to belittle the claims of culture. As soon as I did this, I was faced with the question, if it is a thing of so little value, how are you justified in spending so much of your life on it? The present inordinate esteem of culture by the cultured began, I think, with Matthew Arnold. At least, if I am right in supposing that he first popularized the use of the English word spiritual in the sense of German geistlich. This was nothing less than the identification of levels of life hitherto usually distinguished. After Arnold came the vogue of Croce, in whose philosophy the aesthetic and logical activities were made autonomous forms of the spirit, coordinate with the ethical. There followed the poetics of Dr. I. A. Richards. This great atheist critic found in a good poetical taste the means of attaining psychological adjustments which improved a man's power of effective and satisfactory living all round, while bad taste resulted in a corresponding loss. Since this theory of value was a purely psychological one, this amounted to giving poetry a kind of soteriological function. It held the keys of the only heaven that Dr. Richards believed in. His work, which I respect profoundly, was continued, though not always in directions he accepted, by the editors of Scrutiny, who believed in a necessary relationship between the quality of the individual's response to art and his general fitness for humane living. Finally, as might have been expected, a somewhat similar view was expressed by a Christian writer, in fact by Brother Every in Theology for March 1939. In an article entitled The Necessity of Scrutiny, Brother Every inquired what Mr. Eliot's admirers were to think of a church where those who seemed to be theologically equipped preferred Houseman, Mr. Charles Morgan, and Miss Sayers to Lawrence, Joyce, and Mr. E. M. Forster. He spoke, I think with sympathy, of the sensitive questioning individual who is puzzled at finding the same judgments made by Christians as by other conventional people. And he talked of testing theological students as regards their power to evaluate a new piece of writing on a secular subject. As soon as I read this, there was the devil to pay. I was not sure that I understood, I am still not sure that I understand, Brother Every's position. But I felt that some readers might easily get the notion that sensitivity or good taste were among the notes of the true church, or that coarse, unimaginative people were less likely to be saved than refined and poetic people. In the heat of the moment, I rushed to the opposite extreme. I felt, with some spiritual pride, that I had been saved in the nick of time from being sensitive. The sentimentality and cheapness of much Christian hymnody had been a strong point in my own resistance to conversion. Now I felt almost thankful for the bad hymns. It was good that we should have to lay down our precious refinement at the very doorstep of the church. Good that we should be cured at the outset of our inveterate confusion between psyche and pneuma, nature and supernature. A man is never so proud as when striking an attitude of humility. Brother Every will not suspect me of being still in the condition I describe, nor of still attributing to him the preposterous beliefs I have just suggested. But there remains, none the less, a real problem which his article forced upon me in its most acute form. No one, presumably, is really maintaining that a fine taste in the arts is a condition of salvation. Yet the glory of God, and, as our only means to glorifying Him, the salvation of human souls, is the real business of life. What then is the value of culture? It is, of course, no new question, but as a living question it was new to me. I naturally turned first to the New Testament. Here I found, in the first place, a demand that whatever is most highly valued on the natural level is to be held, as it were, merely on sufferance, and to be abandoned without mercy the moment it conflicts with the service of God. The organs of sense, Matthew chapter 5, verse 29, and of virility, Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, may have to be sacrificed. And I took it that the least these words could mean was that a life, by natural standards, crippled and thwarted, was not only no bar to salvation, but might easily be one of its conditions. The text about hating father and mother, Luke chapter 14, verse 26, and our Lord's apparent belittling even of his own natural relation to the Blessed Virgin, Matthew chapter 12, verse 48, were even more discouraging. I took it for granted that anyone in his senses would hold it better to be a good son than a good critic, and that whatever was said of natural affection was implied a fortiori of culture. The worst of all was Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, where something obviously more relevant to spiritual life than culture can be, blameless conformity to the Jewish law, was described as muck. In the second place, I found a number of emphatic warnings against every kind of superiority. We were told to become as children, Matthew chapter 18, verse 3, not to be called rabbi, Matthew chapter 23, verse 8, to dread reputation, Luke chapter 6, verse 26. We were reminded that few of the sophoi kata savka, which I suppose means precisely the intelligentsia, are called. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26. That a man must become a fool by secular standards before he can attain real wisdom. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. Against all this, I found some passages that could be interpreted in a sense more favorable to culture. I argued that secular learning might be embodied in the Magi, that the talents in the parable might conceivably include talents in the modern sense of the word, that the miracle at Cana in Galilee, by sanctifying an innocent sensuous pleasure, could be taken to sanctify at least a recreational use of culture, mere entertainment, and that aesthetic enjoyment of nature was certainly hallowed by our Lord's praise of the lilies. At least some use of science was implied in St. Paul's demand that we should perceive the invisible through the visible. Romans chapter 1, verse 20. But I was more than doubtful whether his exhortation, "Be not children in mind," 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 20, and his boast of wisdom among the initiate, referred to anything that we should recognize as secular culture. On the whole, the New Testament seemed, if not hostile, yet unmistakably cold to culture. I think we can still believe culture to be innocent after we have read the New Testament. I cannot see that we are encouraged to think it important. It might be important nonetheless, for Hooker has finally answered the contention that Scripture must contain everything important or even everything necessary. Remembering this, I continued my researches. If my selection of authorities seems arbitrary, that is due not to a bias, but to my ignorance. I used such authors as I happened to know. Of the great pagans, Aristotle is on our side. Plato will tolerate no culture that does not directly or indirectly conduce either to the intellectual vision of the good or the military efficiency of the Commonwealth. Joyce and D.H. Lawrence would have fared ill in the Republic. The Buddha was, I believe, anti-cultural, but here especially I speak under correction. St. Augustine regarded the liberal education which he had undergone in his boyhood as a dementia, and wondered why it should be considered honestio et uberio than the really useful primary education which preceded it. Confessions 1:13. He is extremely distrustful of his own delight in church music. Confessions 10:33. A tragedy which for Dr. Richards is a great exercise of the spirit, is for St. Augustine a kind of sore. The spectator suffers, yet loves his suffering, and this is a miserabilis insania. Quid autem mirum cum in felix pecus, aberrans aggrege tuo et impatiens custodiae tuae turpis gabiae foedera. Confessions 3:2. St. Jerome, allegorizing the parable of the prodigal son, suggests that the husks with which he was fain to fill his belly may signify cibus daemonum. Carmina poeterum, secularis sapientia, rhetoricorum pompa verborum. Epistle 21:4. Let none reply that the Fathers were speaking of polytheistic literature at a time when polytheism was still a danger. The scheme of values presupposed in most imaginative literature has not become very much more Christian since the time of St. Jerome. In Hamlet we see everything questioned except the duty of revenge. In all Shakespeare's works, the conception of good really operative, whatever the characters may say, seems to be purely worldly. In medieval romance, honor and sexual love are the true values. In 19th century fiction, sexual love and material prosperity. In romantic poetry, either the enjoyment of nature, ranging from pantheistic mysticism at one end of the scale to mere innocent sensuousness at the other, or else the indulgence of a Sehnsucht, awakened by the past, the distant and the imagined but not believed supernatural. In modern literature, the life of liberated instinct. There are, of course, exceptions, but to study these exceptions would not be to study literature as such, and as a whole. All literatures, as Newman has said, are one. They are the voices of the natural man. If literature is to be made a study of human nature, you cannot have a Christian literature. It is a contradiction in terms to attempt a sinless literature of sinful man. And I could not doubt that the sub-Christian or anti-Christian values implicit in most literature did actually infect many readers. Only a few days ago I was watching, in some scholarship papers, the results of this infection, in a belief that the crimes of such Shakespearean characters as Cleopatra and Macbeth were somehow compensated for by a quality described as their greatness. This very morning I have read in a critic the remark that if the wicked lovers in Webster's White Devil had repented, we should hardly have forgiven them. And many people certainly draw from Keats's phrase about negative capability, or love of good and evil, if the reading which attributes to him such meaningless words is correct, a strange doctrine that experience simpliciter is good. I do not say that the sympathetic reading of literature must produce such results, but that it may, and often does. If we are to answer the Father's attack on pagan literature, we must not ground our answer on a belief that literature as a whole has become, in any important sense, more Christian since their days. In Thomas Aquinas I could not find anything directly bearing on my problem, but I am very poor Thomist, and shall be grateful for correction on this point. Thomas à Kempis I take to be definitely on the anti-cultural side. In the Theologia Germanica, chapter 20, I found that nature's refusal of the life of Christ happeneth most of all where there are high natural gifts of reason, for that soareth upwards in its own light and by its own power, till at last it cometh to think itself the true eternal light. But in a later chapter, 42, I found the evil of the false light identified with its tendency to love knowledge and discernment more than the object known and discerned. This seemed to point to the possibility of a knowledge which avoided that error. The cumulative effect of all this was very discouraging to culture. On the other side, perhaps only through the accidental distribution of my ignorance, I found much less. I found the famous saying, attributed to Gregory, that our use of secular culture was comparable to the action of the Israelites in going down to the Philistines to have their knives sharpened. This seems to me a most satisfactory argument as far as it goes, and very relevant to modern conditions. If we are to convert our heathen neighbours, we must understand their culture. We must beat them at their own game. But of course, while this would justify Christian culture, at least for some Christians whose vocation lay in that direction at the moment, it would come very far short of the claims made for culture in our modern tradition. On the Gregorian view, culture is a weapon, and a weapon is essentially a thing we lay aside as soon as we safely can. In Milton I found a disquieting ally. His Areopagitica troubled me just as Brother Every's article had troubled me. He seemed to make too little of the difficulties, and his glorious defence of freedom to explore all good and evil seemed, after all, to be based on an aristocratic preoccupation with great souls and a contemptuous indifference to the mass of mankind, which, I suppose, no Christian can tolerate. Finally, I came to that book of Newman's from which I have already quoted, the Lectures on University Education. Here, at last, I found an author who seemed to be aware of both sides of the question. For no one ever insisted so eloquently as Newman on the beauty of culture for its own sake, and no one ever so sternly resisted the temptation to confuse it with things spiritual. The cultivation of the intellect, according to him, is for this world. Between it and genuine religion there is a radical difference. It makes not the Christian, but the gentleman, and looks like virtue only at a distance. He will not for an instant allow that it makes men better. The pastors of the Church may indeed welcome culture because it provides innocent distraction at those moments of spiritual relaxation which would otherwise very likely lead to sin. And in this way it often draws the mind off from things which will harm it to subjects worthy of a rational being. But even in so doing, it does not raise it above nature, nor has any tendency to make us pleasing to our Maker. In some instances, the cultural and the spiritual value of an activity may even be in inverse ratio. Theology, when it ceases to be part of liberal knowledge and is pursued for purely pastoral ends, gain in meritoriousness, but loses in liberality, just as a face worn by tears and fasting loses its beauty. On the other hand, Newman is certain that liberal knowledge is an end in itself. The whole of the fourth discourse is devoted to this theme. The solution of this apparent antinomy lies in his doctrine that everything, including, of course, the intellect, has its own perfection. Things animate, inanimate, visible, invisible, all are good in their kind and have a best of themselves, which is an object of pursuit. To perfect the mind is an object as intelligible as the cultivation of virtue, while, at the same time, it is absolutely distinct from it. Whether because I am too poor a theologian to understand the implied doctrine of grace and nature, or for some other reason, I have not been able to make Newman's conclusion my own. I can well understand that there is a kind of goodness which is not moral, as a well-grown healthy toad is better or more perfect than a three-legged toad, or an archangel is better than an angel. In this sense, a clever man is better than a dull one, or any man than a chimpanzee. The trouble comes when we start asking how much of our time and energy God wants us to spend in becoming better or more perfect in this sense. If Newman is right in saying that culture has no tendency to make us pleasing to our Maker, then the answer would seem to be none. And that is a tenable view, as though God said, "Your natural degree of perfection, your place in the chain of being, is my affair. Do you get on with what I have explicitly left as your task, righteousness?" But if Newman had thought this, he would not, I suppose, have written the discourse on liberal knowledge its own end. On the other hand, it would be possible to hold, perhaps it is pretty generally held, that one of the moral duties of a rational creature was to attain to the highest non-moral perfection it could. But if this were so, then a. The perfecting of the mind would not be absolutely distinct from virtue, but part of the content of virtue, and b. It would be very odd that Scripture and the tradition of the Church have little or nothing to say about this duty. I am afraid that Newman has left the problem very much where he found it. He has clarified our minds by explaining that culture gives us a non-moral perfection. But on the real problem, that of relating such non-moral values to the duty or interest of creatures who are every minute advancing either to heaven or hell, he seems to help little. Sensitivity may be a perfection, but if by becoming sensitive I neither please God nor save my soul, why should I become sensitive? Indeed, what exactly is meant by a perfection compatible with utter loss of the end for which I was created? My researches left me with the impression that there could be no question of restoring to culture the kind of status which I had given it before my conversion. If any constructive case for culture was to be built up, it would have to be of a much humbler kind. And the whole tradition of educated infidelity, from Arnold to Scrutiny, appeared to me as but one phase in that general rebellion against God which began in the 18th century. In this mood I set about construction. 1. I begin at the lowest and least ambitious level. My own professional work, though conditioned by taste and talents, is immediately motivated by the need for earning my living. And on earning one's living, I was relieved to note that Christianity, in spite of its revolutionary and apocalyptic elements, can be delightfully humdrum. The Baptists did not give the tax-gatherers and soldiers lectures on the immediate necessity of turning the economic and military system of the ancient world upside down. He told them to obey the moral law, as they had presumably learned it from their mothers and nurses, and sent them back to their jobs. St. Paul advised the Thessalonians to stick to their work, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 11, and not to become busybodies, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 11. The need for money is therefore simpliciter and innocent, though by no means a splendid motive for any occupation. The Ephesians are warned to work professionally at something that is good, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. I hope that good here did not mean much more than harmless, and I was certain it did not imply anything very elevated. Provided, then, that there was a demand for culture, and that culture was not actually deleterious, I concluded I was justified in making my living by supplying that demand, and that all others in my position, dons, schoolmasters, professional authors, critics, reviewers, were similarly justified, especially if, like me, they had few or no talents for any other career. If their vocation to a cultural profession consisted in the brute fact of not being fit for anything else. 2. But is culture even harmless? It certainly can be harmful, and often is. If a Christian found himself in the position of one inaugurating a new society in vacuo, he might well decide not to introduce something whose abuse is so easy and whose use is, at any rate, not necessary. But that is not our position. The abuse of culture is already there, and will continue whether Christians cease to be cultured or not. It is therefore probably better that the ranks of the culture sellers should include some Christians, as an antidote. It may even be the duty of some Christians to be culture sellers. And not that I have yet said anything to show that even the lawful use of culture stands very high. The lawful use might be no more than innocent pleasure, but if the abuse is common, the task of resisting that abuse might be not only lawful, but obligatory. Thus, people in my position might be said to be working the thing which is good in a stronger sense than that reached in the last paragraph. In order to avoid misunderstanding, I must add that when I speak of resisting the abuse of culture, I do not mean that a Christian should take money for supplying one thing, culture, and use the opportunity thus gained to supply a quite different thing, homiletics and apologetics, that is, stealing. The mere presence of Christians in the ranks of the culture sellers will inevitably provide an antidote. It will be seen that I have now reached something very like the Gregorian view of culture as a weapon. Can I now go a step further and find any intrinsic goodness in culture for its own sake? 3. When I ask what culture has done to me personally, the most obviously true answer is that it has given me quite an enormous amount of pleasure. I have no doubt at all that pleasure is in itself a good, and pain in itself an evil. If not, then the whole Christian tradition about heaven and hell and the passion of our Lord seems to have no meaning. Pleasure, then, is good. A sinful pleasure means a good offered and accepted under conditions which involve a breach of the moral law. The pleasures of culture are not intrinsically bound up with such conditions, though of course they can very easily be so enjoyed as to involve them. Often, as Newman saw, they are an excellent diversion from guilty pleasures. We may therefore enjoy them ourselves, and lawfully, even charitably, teach others to enjoy them. This view gives us some ease, though it would go a very little way towards satisfying the editors of Scrutiny. We should indeed be justified in propagating good taste on the ground that cultured pleasure in the arts is more varied, intense, and lasting than vulgar or popular pleasure. But we should not regard it as meritorious. In fact, much as we should differ from Bentham about value in general, we should have to be Benthamites on the issue between pushpin and poetry. 4. It was noticed above that the values assumed in literature were seldom those of Christianity. Some of the principal values actually implicit in European literature were described as A. Honor, B. Sexual love, C. Material prosperity, D. Pantheistic contemplation of nature, E. Sehnsucht, awakened by the past, the remote, or the imagined supernatural, F. Liberation of impulses. These were called sub-Christian. This is a term of disapproval if we are comparing them with Christian values. But if we take sub-Christian to mean immediately sub-Christian, i.e., the highest level of merely natural value lying immediately below the lowest level of spiritual value, it may be a term of relative approval. Some of the 6 values I have enumerated may be sub-Christian in this relatively good sense. For C and F I can make no defence. Whenever they are accepted by the reader with anything more than a willing suspension of disbelief, they must make him worse. But the other 4 are all two-edged. I may symbolize what I think of them all by the aphorism, "Any road out of Jerusalem must also be a road into Jerusalem." Thus, A. To the perfected Christian, the ideal of honor is simply a temptation. His courage has a better root, and, being learned in Gethsemane, may have no honor about it. But to the man coming up from below, the ideal of knighthood may prove a schoolmaster to the ideal of martyrdom. Galahad is the son of Lancelot. B. The road described by Dante and Patmore is a dangerous one. But mere animalism, however disguised as honesty, frankness, or the like, is not dangerous, but fatal. And not all are qualified to be, even in sentiment, eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. For some souls, romantic love also has proved a schoolmaster. D. There is any easy transition from theism to pantheism, but there is also a blessed transition in the other direction. For some souls, I believe, for my own, I remember, Wordsworthian contemplation can be the first and lowest form of recognition that there is something outside ourselves which demands reverence. To return to pantheistic errors about the nature of this something would, for a Christian, be very bad. But once again, for the man coming up from below, the Wordsworthian experience is an advance. Even if he goes no further, he has escaped the worst arrogance of materialism. If he goes on, he will be converted. E. The dangers of romantic Sehnsucht are very great. Eroticism and even occultism lie in wait for it. On this subject, I can only give my own experience for what it is worth. When we are first converted, I suppose we think mostly of our recent sins, but as we go on, more and more of the terrible past comes under review. In this process, I have not, or not yet, reached a point at which I can honestly repent of my earlier experiences of romantic Sehnsucht. That they were occasions to much that I do repent is clear. But I still cannot help thinking that this was my abuse of them, and that the experiences themselves contained from the very first a wholly good element. Without them, my conversion would have been more difficult. I have dwelt chiefly on certain kinds of literature, not because I think them the only elements in culture that have this value as schoolmasters, but because I know them best, and on literature rather than art and knowledge for the same reason. My general case may be stated in Richardian terms, that culture is a storehouse of the best sub-Christian values. These values are in themselves of the soul, not the spirit. But God created the soul. Its values may be expected, therefore, to contain some reflection or antipast of the spiritual values. They will save no man. They resemble the regenerate life only as affection resembles charity, or honour resembles virtue, or the moon the sun. But though like is not the same, it is better than unlike. Imitation may pass into initiation. For some it is a good beginning. For others it is not. Culture is not everyone's road into Jerusalem, and for some it is a road out. There is another way in which it may predispose to conversion. The difficulty of converting an uneducated man nowadays lies in his complacency. Popularized science, the conventions or unconventions of his immediate circle, party programs, etc., enclose him in a tiny windowless universe which he mistakes for the only possible universe. There are no distant horizons, no mysteries. He thinks everything has been settled. A cultured person, on the other hand, is almost compelled to be aware that reality is very odd, and that the ultimate truth, whatever it may be, must have the characteristics of strangeness, must be something that would seem remote and fantastic to the uncultured. Thus some obstacles to faith have been removed already. On these grounds, I conclude that culture has a distinct part to play in bringing certain souls to Christ. Not all souls. There is a shorter and safer way which has always been followed by thousands of simple affectional natures who begin, where we hope to end, with devotion to the person of Christ. Has it any part to play in the life of the converted? I think so, and in two ways. A. If all the cultural values on the way up to Christianity were dim antipasts and ectypes of the truth, we can recognize them as such still. And since we must rest and play, where can we do so better than here, in the suburbs of Jerusalem? It is lawful to rest our eyes in moonlight, especially now that we know where it comes from, that it is only sunlight at second hand. B. Whether the purely contemplative life is or is not desirable for any, it is certainly not the vocation of all. Most men must glorify God by doing to his glory something which is not per se an act of glorifying, but which becomes so by being offered. If, as I now hope, cultural activities are innocent and even useful, then they also, like the sweeping of the room in Herbert's poem, can be done to the Lord. The work of a charwoman and the work of a poet become spiritual in the same way and on the same condition. There must be no return to the Arnoldian or Richardian view. Let us stop giving ourselves airs. If it is argued that the sensitivity which Brother Every desires is something different from my culture or good taste, I must reply that I have chosen those words as the most general terms for something which is differently conceived in every age: wit, correctness, imagination, and now sensitivity. These names, of course, record real changes of opinion about it. But if it were contended that the latest conception is so different from all its predecessors that we now have a radically new situation, that while wit was not necessary for a 7th century Christian, sensitivity is necessary for a 20th century Christian, I should find this very hard to believe. Sensitivity is a potentiality, therefore neutral. It can no more be an end to Christians than experience. If Philippians chapter 1 verse 9 is quoted against me, I reply that delicate discriminations are there traced to charity, not to critical experience of books. Every virtue is a habitus, i.e., a good stock response. And Dr. Richards very candidly recognizes this when he speaks of people hag-ridden by their vices or their virtues, italics mine. But we want to be so ridden. I do not want a sensitivity which will show me how different each temptation to lust or cowardice is from the last, how unique, how unamenable to general rules. A stock response is precisely what I need to acquire. Moral theologians, I believe, tell us to fly at sight from temptations to faith or chastity. If that is not, in Dr. Richards's words, a stock, stereotyped, conventional response, I do not know what is. In fact, the new ideal of sensitivity seems to me to present culture to Christians in a somewhat less favourable light than its predecessors. Sidney's poetics would be better. The whole school of critical thought which descends from Dr. Richards bears such deep marks of its anti-Christian origins that I question if it can ever be baptized. 2. To the Editor of Theology. Sir, Mr. Bethel's main position is so important that I hope you will allow me at some future date to deal with it in a full-length argument. For the moment, therefore, I will only say, 1. That I made no reference to his previous paper for the worst of reasons and the best of causes, namely, that I had forgotten it. For this negligence I ask his pardon. On looking back at the relevant number of Theology, I see from marginalia in my own hand that I must have read his contribution with great interest. For my forgetfulness, I can only plead that a great many things have happened to us all since then. I am distressed that Mr. Bethel should suppose himself deliberately slighted. I intended no disrespect to him. 2. That my position logically implies total depravity, I deny simply. How any logician could derive the proposition human nature is totally depraved from the proposition cultural activities do not in themselves improve our spiritual condition, I cannot understand. Even if I had said, which I did not, man's aesthetic nature is totally depraved, no one could infer man's whole nature is totally depraved without a glaring transference from secundum quid to simpliciter. I put it to Mr. Bethel that he has used logically implies to mean may without gross uncharity rouse the suspicion of, and that he ought not to use words that way. To Mr. Carrett I reply that my argument assumed the divinity of Christ, the truth of the creeds, and the authority of the Christian tradition, because I was writing in an Anglican periodical. That is why Dominical and patristic sayings have for me more than an antiquarian interest. But though my attribution of authority to Christ or the Fathers may depend on premises which Mr. Carrett does not accept, my belief that it is proper to combine my own reasonings with the witness of authority has a different ground, prior to any decision on the question, who is authoritative? One of the things my reason tells me is that I ought to check the results of my own thinking by the opinions of the wise. I go to authority because reason sends me to it. Just as Mr. Carrett, after adding up a column of figures, might ask a friend, known to be a good calculator, to check it for him, and might distrust his own result if his friend got a different one. I said that culture was a storehouse of the best sub-Christian values, not the best sub-Christian virtues. I meant by this that culture recorded man striving for those ends which, though not the true end of man, the fruition of God, have nevertheless some degree of similarity to it, and are not so grossly inadequate to the nature of man as, say, physical pleasure or money. This similarity, of course, while making it less evil to rest in them, makes the danger of resting in them greater and more subtle. The salvation of souls is a means to the glorifying of God, because only saved souls can duly glorify Him. The thing to which, on my view, culture must be subordinated is not, though it includes, moral virtue, but the conscious direction of all will and desire to a transcendental person in whom I believe all values to reside, and the reference to Him in every thought and act. Since that person loves righteousness, this total surrender to Him involves Mr. Carrett's conscientiousness. It would therefore be impossible to glorify God by doing what we thought wrong. Doing what we think right, on the other hand, is not the same as glorifying God. I fully agree with Mr. Carrett that, a priori, we might expect the production of whatever is good to be one of our duties. If God had never spoken to man, we should be justified in basing the conduct of life wholly on such a priori grounds. Those who think God has spoken will naturally listen to what He has to say about the where, how, to what extent, and in what spirit any good is to be pursued. This does not mean that our own conscience is simply negated. On the contrary, just as reason sends me to authority, so conscience sends me to obedience. For one of the things my conscience tells me is that if there exists an absolutely wise and good person, Aristotle's Phronimos raised to the 9th, I owe him obedience, especially when that person, as the ground of my existence, has a kind of paternal claim on me, and, as a benefactor, has a claim on my gratitude. What would happen if there were an absolute clash between God's will and my own conscience, i.e., if either God could be bad, or I were an incurable moral idiot, I naturally do not know, any more than Mr. Carrett knows what would happen if he found absolutely demonstrative evidence for two contradictory propositions. I mentioned Hooker not because he simply denied that Scripture contains all things necessary, but because he advanced a proof that it cannot, which proof, I supposed, most readers of theology would remember. Text hunting is, of course, puritanical, but also scholastic, patristic, apostolic, and dominical. To that kind of charge I venture, presuming on an indulgence which Mr. Carrett has extended to me for nearly 20 years, to reply with homely saws. As that an old trout can't be caught by tickling, and they know a trick worth 2 of that where I come from. Puritan, quotha. Yours faithfully, C.S. Lewis. 3. Peace proposals for Brother Every and Mr. Bethel. I believe there is little real disagreement between my critics, Brother Every and Mr. Bethel, and myself. Mr. Carrett, who does not accept the Christian premises, must here be left out of account, though with all the respect and affection I feel for my old tutor and friend. The conclusion I reached in theology, March 1940, was that culture, though not in itself meritorious, was innocent and pleasant, might be a vocation for some, was helpful in bringing certain souls to Christ, and could be pursued to the glory of God. I do not see that Brother Every and Mr. Bethel really want me to go beyond this position. The argument of Mr. Bethel's paper in Theology, July 1939, excluding its historical section, which does not here concern us, was that the deepest and often unconscious beliefs of a writer were implicit in his work, even in what might seem the minor details of its style, and that, unless we were Croceans, such beliefs must be taken into account in estimating the value of that work. In Theology, May 1940, Mr. Bethel reaffirmed this doctrine, with the addition that the latent beliefs in much modern fiction were naturalistic, and that we needed trained critics to put Christian readers on their guard against this pervasive influence. Brother Every, in Theology, September 1940, maintained that our tastes are symptomatic of our real standards of value, which may differ from our professed standards, and that we needed trained critics to show us the real latent standards in literature, in fact, to teach us how to read. I cannot see that my own doctrine and those of my critics come into direct contradiction at any point. My fear was lest excellence in reading and writing were being elevated into a spiritual value, into something meritorious per se, just as other things excellent and wholesome in themselves, like conjugal love, in the sense of eros, or physical cleanliness, have at some times and in some circles been confused with virtue itself, or esteemed necessary parts of it. But it now appears that my critics never intended to make any such claim. A bad taste for them is not itself spiritual evil, but the symptom which betrays, or the carrier which circulates, spiritual evil. And the spiritual evil thus betrayed or carried turns out not to be any specifically cultural or literary kind of evil, but false beliefs or standards, that is, intellectual error or moral baseness. And as I never intended to deny that error and baseness were evils, nor that literature could imply and carry them, I think that all three of us may shake hands and say we are agreed. I do not mean to suggest that my critics have merely restated a platitude which neither I nor anyone else ever disputed. The value of their contribution lies in their assistance that the real beliefs may differ from the professed, and may lurk in the turn of a phrase or the choice of an epithet, with the result that many preferences which seem to the ignorant to be simply matters of taste are visible to the trained critic as choices between good and evil, or truth and error. And I fully admit that this important point had been neglected in my essay of March 1940. And now that it has been made, I heartily accept it. I think this is agreement. But to test the depth of agreement, I would like my critics to consider the following positions. By agreement, I mean only agreement in our doctrines. Differences of temper and emphasis between Christian critics are inevitable and probably desirable. 1. Is it the function of the trained critic to discover the latent beliefs and standards in a book, or to pass judgment on them when discovered, or both? I think Brother Every confines the critic's function to discovery. About Mr. Bethel, I am not so sure. When he says, Theology, May 1940, page 360, that we need a minority of trained critics to lay bare the false values of contemporary culture, this might mean two things. A. To expose the falsity of the values of contemporary culture. B. To reveal what the values of contemporary culture actually are, and by the way I personally think those values false. It is necessary to clear this up before we know what is meant by a trained critic. Trained in what? A man who has had a literary training may be an expert in disengaging the beliefs and values latent in literature. But the judgment on those beliefs and values, that is, the judgment on all possible human thoughts and moralities, belongs either to a quite different set of experts, theologians, philosophers, casuists, scientists, or else not to experts at all, but to the unspecialized, good and wise man, the phrominos. Now I, for my part, have no objection to our doing both when we criticize, but I think it very important to keep the two operations distinct. In the discovery of the latent belief, we have had a special training and speak as experts. In the judgment of the beliefs, once they have been discovered, we humbly hope that we are being trained, like everyone else, by reason and ripening experience, under the guidance of the Holy Ghost as long as we live. But we speak on them simply as men, on a level with all our even Christians, and indeed with less authority than any illiterate man who happens to be older, wiser, and purer than we. To transfer to these judgments any specialist authority which may belong to us as trained critics is charlatanism, if the attempt is conscious, and confusion if it is not. If Brother Every, see Theology, September 1940, page 161, condemns a book because of English liberal implications, he is really saying two things. A. This book has English liberal implications. B. English liberalism is an evil. The first he utters with authority because he is a trained critic. In the second, he may be right or he may be wrong, but he speaks with no more authority than any other man. A failure to observe this distinction may turn literary criticism into a sort of stalking horse, from behind which a man may shoot all his personal opinions on any and every subject without ever really arguing in their defence, and under cover of a quite irrelevant specialist training in literature. I do not accuse Brother Every of this, but a glance at any modern review will show that it is an ever-present danger. 2. In Theology, May 1940, page 359, Mr. Bethel speaks of some form of biological or economic naturalism as the unconscious attitude in most popular fiction of today, and cites, as straws that show the wind, the popularity of urges and overmastering passions. Now, fortunately, I agree with Mr. Bethel in thinking naturalism an erroneous philosophy, and I am ready to grant, for the purposes of argument, that those who talk about urges do so because they are unconsciously naturalistic. But when all this has been granted, can we honestly say that the whole of our dislike of urges is explained, without remainder, by our disagreement with naturalism? Surely not. Surely we object to that way of writing for another reason as well, because it is so worn, so facile, so obviously attempting to be impressive, so associated in our minds with dullness and pomposity. In other words, there are two elements in our reaction. One is the detection of an attitude in the writer which, as instructed Christians and amateur philosophers, we disapprove. The other is really and strictly an affair of taste. Now these, again, require to be kept distinct. Being fallen creatures, we tend to resent offences against our taste at least as much as, or even more than, offences against our conscience or reason. And we would dearly like to be able, if only we can find any plausible argument for doing so, to inflict upon the man whose writing, perhaps for reasons utterly unconnected with good and evil, has afflicted us like a bad smell, the same kind of condemnation which we can inflict on him who has uttered the false and the evil. The tendency is easily observed among children. Friendship wavers when you discover that a hitherto trusted playmate actually likes prunes. But even for adults it is sweet, sweet, sweet poison to feel able to imply, "Thus saith the Lord," at the end of every expression of our pet aversions. To avoid this horrible danger, we must perpetually try to distinguish, however closely they get entwined both by the subtle nature of the facts and by the secret importunity of our passions, those attitudes in a writer which we can honestly and confidently condemn as real evils, and those qualities in his writing which simply annoy and offend us as men of taste. This is difficult, because the latter are often so much more obvious and provoke such a very violent response. The only safe course seems to me to be this: to reserve our condemnation of attitudes for attitudes universally acknowledged to be bad by the Christian conscience, speaking in agreement with Scripture and ecumenical tradition. A bad book is deemed to be a real evil in so far as it can be shown to prompt to sensuality, or pride, or murder, or to conflict with the doctrine of divine providence, or the like. The other dyslogistic terms dear to critics, vulgar, derivative, cheap, precious, academic, affected, bourgeois, Victorian, Georgian, literary, etc., had better be kept strictly on the taste side of the account. In discovering what attitudes are present, you can be as subtle as you like. But in your theological and ethical condemnation, as distinct from your dislike of the taste, you had better be very unsubtle. You had better reserve it for plain mortal sins and plain atheism and heresy. For our passions are always urging us in the opposite direction, and if we are not careful, criticism may become a mere excuse for taking revenge on books whose smell we dislike, by erecting our temperamental antipathies into pseudo-moral judgments. 3. In practical life, a certain amount of reading between the lines is necessary. If we took every letter and every remark simply at its face value, we should soon find ourselves in difficulties. On the other hand, most of us have known people with whom reading between the lines became such a mania that they overlooked the obvious truth of every situation, and lived in the perpetual discovery of mares' nests. And doctors tell us of a form of lunacy in which the simplest remark uttered in the patient's presence becomes to him evidence of a conspiracy, and the very furniture of his cell takes on an infinitely sinister significance. Will my critics admit that the subtle and difficult task of digging out the latent beliefs and values, however necessary, is attended with some danger of our neglecting the obvious and surface facts about a book, whose importance, even if less than that of the latent facts, is certainly much higher than zero? Suppose two books, A and B. Suppose it can be truly said of A, "The very style of this book reveals great sensitivity and honesty, and a readiness for total commitments, excellent raw material for sanctity if ever the author were converted." And suppose it can be truly said of B, "The very style of this book betrays a woolly, uncompromising state of mind, knee-deep entangled in the materialistic values which the author thinks he has rejected." But might it not also be true to say of Book A, "Despite its excellent latent implications, its ostensible purpose, which will corrupt thousands of readers, is the continued glorification of mortal sin"? And of B, "Despite its dreadful latent materialism, it does set courage and fidelity before the reader in an attractive light, and thousands of readers will be edified, though much less edified than they suppose, by reading it." And is there not a danger of this second truth being neglected? We want the abstruse knowledge in addition to the obvious, not instead of it. 4. It is clear that the simple and ignorant are least able to resist, by reason, the influence of latent evil in the books they read. But is it not also true that this is often balanced by a kind of protection which comes to them through ignorance itself? I base this on 3 grounds. A. Adults often disquiet themselves about the effect of a work upon children. For example, the effect of the bad elements in Peter Pan, such as the desire not to grow up, or the sentimentalities about Wendy. But if I may trust my own memory, childhood simply does not receive these things. It rightly wants and enjoys the flying, the Indians, and the pirates, not to mention the pleasure of being in a theatre at all, and just accepts the rest of part of the meaningless roughage which occurs in all books and plays. For at that age we never expect any work of art to be interesting all through. When I began writing stories in exercise books, I tried to put off all the things I really wanted to write about till at least the 2nd page. I thought it wouldn't be like a real grown-up book if it became interesting at once. B. I often find expressions in my pupils' essays which seem to me to imply a great deal of latent error and evil. Now, since it would in any case be latent, one does not expect them to own up to it when challenged. But one does expect that a process of exploration would discover the mental atmosphere to which the expression belonged. But in my experience, exploration often produces a conviction that it had, in my pupils' minds, no evil associations, because it had no associations at all. They just thought it was the ordinary way of translating thought into what they supposed to be literary English. Thousands of people are no more corrupted by the implications of urges, dynamism, and progressive than they are edified by the implications of secular, charity, and Platonic. The same process of attrition which empties good language of its virtue does, after all, empty bad language of much of its vice. C. If one speaks to an uneducated man about some of the worst features in a film or a book, does he not often reply unconcernedly, "Ah, they always got to bring a bit of that into a film," or "I reckon they put that in to wind it up like"? And does this not mean that he is aware, even to excess, of the difference between art and life? He expects a certain amount of meaningless nonsense, which expectation, though very regrettable from the cultural point of view, largely protects him from the consequences of which we, in our sophisticated naivety, are afraid. 5. Finally, I agree with Brother Every that our leisure, even our play, is a matter of serious concern. There is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second, is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. But will Brother Every agree in acknowledging a real difficulty about merely recreational reading? I do not include all reading under this head as about games. I mean that they are serious, and yet, to do them at all, we must somehow do them as if they were not. It is a serious matter to choose wholesome recreations, but they would no longer be recreations if we pursued them seriously. When Mr. Bethel speaks of the critic's working hours, May 1940, page 360, I hope he means his hours of criticism, not his hours of reading. For a great deal, not all, of our literature was made to be read lightly for entertainment. If we do not read it, in a sense, for fun, and with our feet on the fender, we are not using it as it was meant to be used, and all our criticism of it will be pure illusion. For you cannot judge any artifact except by using it as it was intended. It is no good judging a butter knife by seeing whether it will saw logs. Much bad criticism, indeed, results from the efforts of critics to get a work-time result out of something that never aimed at producing more than pleasure. There is a real problem here, and I do not see my way through it. But I should be disappointed if my critics denied the existence of the problem. If any real disagreement remains between us, I anticipate that it will be about my third point, about the distinction there drawn between the real spiritual evil carried or betrayed in a book and its mere faults of taste. And on this subject I confess that my critics can present me with a very puzzling dilemma. They can ask me whether the statement, "This is tawdry writing," is an objective statement describing something bad in a book and capable of being true or false, or whether it is merely a statement about the speaker's own feelings, different in form, but fundamentally the same as the proposition, "I don't like oysters." If I choose the latter, then most criticism becomes purely subjective, which I don't want. If I choose the former, then they can ask me, "What are these qualities in a book which you admit to be in some sense good and bad, but which, you keep on warning us, are not really or spiritually good and bad? Is there a kind of good which is not good? Is there any good that is not pleasing to God, or any bad which is not hateful to him?" And if you press me along these lines, I end in doubts. But I will not get rid of those doubts by falsifying the little light I already have. That little light seems to compel me to say that there are two kinds of good and bad. The first, such as virtue and vice, or love and hatred, besides being good or bad themselves, make the possessor good or bad. The second do not. They include such things as physical beauty or ugliness, the possession or lack of a sense of humor, strength or weakness, pleasure or pain. But the two most relevant for us are the two I mentioned at the beginning of this essay: conjugal eros, as distinct from agape, which of course is a good of the first class, and physical cleanliness. Surely we have all met people who said indeed that the latter was next to godliness, but whose unconscious attitude made it a part of godliness, and no small part. And surely we agree that any good of this second class, however good on its own level, becomes an enemy when it thus assumes demonic pretensions, and erects itself into a quasi-spiritual value. As M. de Rougemont has recently told us, the conjugal eros ceases to be a devil only when it ceases to be a god. My whole contention is that in literature, in addition to the spiritual good and evil which it carries, there is also a good and evil of this second class, a properly cultural or literary good and evil, which must not be allowed to masquerade as good and evil of the first class. And I shall feel really happy about all the minor differences between my critics and me when I find in them some recognition of this danger, some admission that they and I, and all of the like education, are daily tempted to a kind of idolatry. I am not pretending to know how this baffling phenomenon, the two kinds or levels of good and evil, is to be fitted into a consistent philosophy of values, but it is one thing to be unable to explain a phenomenon, another to ignore it. And I admit that all of these lower goods ought to be encouraged, that, as pedagogues, it is our duty to try to make our pupils happy and beautiful, to give them cleanly habits and good taste. And the discharge of that duty is, of course, a good of the first class. I will admit, too, that evils of this second class are often the result and symptom of real spiritual evil. Dirty fingernails, a sluggish liver, boredom, and a bad English style may often, in a given case, result from disobedience, laziness, arrogance, or intemperance. But they may also result from poverty or other misfortune. They may even result from virtue. The man's ears may be unwashed behind, or his English style borrowed from the jargon of the daily press, because he has given to good works the time and energy which others use to acquire elegant habits or good language. Gregory the Great, I believe, vaunted the barbarity of his style. Our Lord ate with unwashed hands. I am stating, not solving, a problem. If my critics want to continue the discussion, I think they can do so most usefully by taking it right away from literature and the arts to some other of these mysterious lower goods, where probably all our minds will work more coolly. I should welcome an essay from Brother Every or Mr. Bethel on conjugal eros, or personal cleanliness. My dilemma about literature is that I admit bad taste to be, in some sense, a bad thing, but do not think it per se evil. My critics will probably say the same of physical dirt. If we could thrash the problem out on the neutral ground of clean and dirty fingers, we might return to the battlefield of literature with new lights. I hope it is now unnecessary to point out that in denying taste to be a spiritual value, I am not for a moment suggesting, as Mr. Bethel thought, May 1940, page 357, that it comes under God's arbitrary condemnation. I enjoyed my breakfast this morning, and I think that was a good thing, and do not think it was condemned by God. But I do not think myself a good man for enjoying it. The distinction does not seem to me a very fine one.